Nothing prepares you for the moment you become an orphan. When 8-year-old twin girls watch their mother take her final breath in a one-room cabin, their world crumbles in an instant. With no family in winter coming fast to the Colorado mountains, they face a choice that no child should ever have to make. They can stay and starve or venture into the wilderness to find the mountain man everyone whispers about. He's a ghost of a man who lives alone in the peaks, hiding from his own painful past. When the girls finally track him down and beg him to take them in, he wants to say no. He spent years avoiding people and the hurt they bring. But looking into their desperate eyes, something inside him stirs, a feeling he thought was dead forever. These two small souls might be his last chance at redemption. Can 3 broken people become a family? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the grimy window of the one-room cabin, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floorboards where 2 small figures huddled together beneath their mother's quilt. Ruby and Rose had been born within minutes of each other on a bitter February night 8 years ago, and in all that time, they had never spent a day apart. Now, as they listened to the silence where their mother's labored breathing used to be, that unbreakable bond was all they had left in the world. Ruby, the elder twin by those precious few minutes, had always been the protector. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around a face that held more determination than any 8-year-old should possess. She clutched their mother's warm Bible against her chest, feeling the familiar weight of its leather binding and the loose pages that threatened to scatter like autumn leaves. This book had been their mother's most treasured possession. Read aloud by candlelight during the long winter evenings when the wind howled through the mountain passes like the voices of lost souls. Rose, quieter and more thoughtful, possessed an old soul that seemed to understand things beyond her years. Her lighter hair caught the morning light as she carefully arranged their mother's few belongings: a wooden comb with several missing teeth, a tin cup dented from years of use, and a small sewing kit that had mended countless tears in their simple dresses. Her fingers lingered on each item as if trying to memorize their mother's touch that still seemed to linger on everything she had owned. The cabin that had been their entire world measured barely 12 feet by 15 feet, built by their fathers. Hands from lodgepole pine, he had cut himself from the surrounding forest. Every board, every nail, every careful joint represented hours of back-breaking labor performed out of love for the family he was creating. The single room served as kitchen, parlor, and bedroom all at once, with a stone fireplace that their father had built with rocks gathered from the creek bed below. 2 small beds occupied one corner, while a rough table and 2 chairs filled the center of the space. Shelves lined one wall, holding their meager supplies and the few books their mother had brought from her life before the mountains. Their mother, Margaret, had been a schoolteacher in Denver before she met their father. She often spoke of the days when she stood before a classroom of eager children, sharing the magic of letters and numbers and stories that could transport young minds to distant places. But she never spoke with regret about the life she had left behind. When she talked about meeting Samuel, their father, her eyes would light up with a warmth that could chase away even the coldest. Mountain Chill. Samuel had been a prospector with dreams of striking it rich in the Colorado goldfields. He was a gentle man with calloused hands and a laugh that echoed off the canyon walls. Margaret would tell the twins how he courted her with wildflowers picked from hidden meadows and poems he wrote by campfire light. They had married within 6 months of meeting, and together they had built this cabin, this life, this family that felt complete despite its simplicity. The twins had grown up surrounded by love, even as they lived on the edge of survival. Their father taught them to read the signs of changing weather and the color of the sky and the behavior of the animals. He showed them which plants were safe to eat and which ones could kill, how to track game through the forest, and how to find water even in the driest months. Their mother continued their education with lessons from her books, teaching them to read and write and cipher, filling their minds with stories of faraway places and people who live very different lives. But 3 years ago, everything changed. Samuel had left early one morning, heading down to the lower valleys where rumors persisted of a new gold strike. He carried with him their last $20 and a heart full of hope that this time would be different. The twins remembered watching him disappear into the morning mist, his familiar figure growing smaller until the forest swallowed him completely. He had promised to return before the first snow, laden with enough gold to buy them a proper house in town and a future free from want. The first snow came early that year, and Samuel never returned. Search parties found his camp, but no trace of the man himself. Some said he had been killed by claim jumpers. Others whispered that he had simply walked away from his responsibilities, though anyone who knew Samuel knew better than that. Margaret never stopped believing he would come home, even as the months turned to years and their meager savings dwindled to nothing. Without Samuel's hunting skills and the occasional gold he panned from the creek, life became a constant struggle for survival. Margaret took in sewing when she could, mending clothes for the few families scattered throughout the high country. She sold vegetables from the small garden Samuel had planted, though the short growing season and harsh conditions made farming more hope than certainty. Sometimes traders would stop by, offering a few coins for fresh bread or a hot meal, but these visits became rarer as word spread that Samuel was gone. The twins learned to contribute in whatever ways they could. Ruby became skilled at setting snares for rabbits and ptarmigan, while Rose developed an almost supernatural ability to find edible plants and roots. They gathered berries in summer, nuts in fall, and learned to make their food stores last through the long months when nothing grew and game was scarce. Their mother taught them to be grateful for what they had, to find joy in small things, and to never lose hope that better days lay ahead. But as the years passed, the isolation began to wear on all of them. Margaret's health, never robust in the harsh mountain climate, began to fail. She developed a persistent cough that grew worse each winter, and her once bright eyes began to dim with exhaustion and worry. She hid her growing weakness from the twins as long as she could, but children see more than adults realize. They noticed how she would pause to catch her breath after simple tasks, how her hands shook when she thought they weren't looking, how she would stare out the window with an expression that spoke of profound loneliness. 2 weeks ago, Margaret's condition took a turn for the worse. The cough that had plagued her for months suddenly became violent, bringing up blood that stained her handkerchief bright red. She took to her bed, insisting it was just a cold, but the twins knew better. They had seen enough death in the mountains to recognize its approach, in the way animals would grow still and quiet. In the manner their mother's breathing became labored and a regular dot in her final days. Margaret spoke often of their father, as if his presence had become more real to her than the physical world around her. She would whisper conversations with Samuel, sometimes laughing at jokes only she could hear, sometimes weeping for reasons the twins couldn't understand. But in her more lucid moments, she would pull them close and speak of practical matters: where to find food when the pantry was empty, how to keep the fire burning through the night, and most importantly, where to go if something happened to her. "There's a man in the mountains," she would say, her voice barely above a whisper. "A good man who lost his way, just like we did. If you ever need help, if you ever have nowhere else to turn, you must find him. He lives high up, where the eagles nest, where the world is closer to heaven. Look for the smoke from his chimney, and don't be afraid of his gruff ways. Deep down, he has a heart that remembers how to love." The twins had pressed her for more details, but Margaret would only smile and close her eyes. "You'll know him when you see him," she would say. "And he'll know you too. though he might not admit it at first. "Take this with you when you go." She pressed something into Ruby's palm, a hand-carved wooden cross, small enough to hide in a child's fist, with initials carved so finely they were barely visible. Amo plus JM now. As they sat in the aftermath of their mother's death, the twins faced the reality of their situation with a clarity that would have been heartbreaking in its maturity if anyone had been there to witness it. They had enough food for perhaps a week, enough firewood for 3 days, and no skills or resources to survive a Colorado winter alone. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and the nearest town was a full day's journey on foot, assuming they could find their way through mountain passes. They had never traveled. Ruby stood and walked to the window, looking out at the towering peaks that surrounded their small valley. Somewhere up there, according to their mother's dying words, lived a man who might help them. It seemed like an impossible quest, like something from one of the fairy tales their mother used to read aloud. But fairy tales were all they had left now, and even the most impossible journey seemed preferable to simply waiting to die. Rose joined her sister at the window, and together they stared up at the mountains that had been both protector and prison for their entire lives. The peaks stretched endlessly into the distance, covered with forests so dense they looked like green velvet from this distance. Somewhere up there, among the eagles and the clouds, a man waited who might be their salvation or their doom. "We have to try," Ruby said finally, her voice steady despite the fear that clenched her stomach like a cold fist. Rose nodded, clutching the wooden cross their mother had given them. "We have to try," she agreed. And so, on a crisp October morning, with winter already showing its teeth in the high country, 2 8-year-old girls began to prepare for a journey that would either save their lives or end them. They were about to discover that sometimes the most important journeys begin not with a single step, but with a single act of faith in the unknown. The journey began before dawn, when the mountain air held the bite of coming winter, and their breath formed small clouds in the pale light. Ruby and Rose had spent the previous evening packing what little they could carry, a few pieces of bread. Wrapped in cloth, their mother's Bible, the wooden cross, and a knife their father had used for whittling. Everything else, every reminder of the only home they had ever known, would have to stay behind. Ruby shouldered the small bundle they had made from one of their mother's shawls, while Rose carried their father's old canteen filled with water. From the creek, they looked back only once at the cabin that had sheltered their entire lives, then turned their faces toward the mountains and began to walk. The first few hours passed easily enough. They followed the creek that ran past their cabin, knowing it would lead them higher into the peaks where their mother had said the mountain man lived. The path was familiar for the first mile or so. They had played along this stretch of water countless times, catching minnows with their bare hands and building small dams from creek stones. But as the morning wore on, they moved beyond the boundaries of their known world and into territory that existed only in their imaginations. The creek led them through stands of aspen trees, whose leaves had turned golden with the season, creating a tunnel of light that flickered and danced with every breath of wind. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by a carpet of fallen leaves that rustled like whispered secrets with each step. For a few precious hours, the twins almost forgot the gravity of their situation, lost in the simple wonder of exploring new places. But as the sun climbed higher and the terrain grew more challenging, reality began to assert itself. The gentle incline they had been following grew steeper, forcing them to stop more frequently to catch their breath. Their legs, accustomed to the flat areas around their cabin, began to ache from the constant upward climb. The creek, which had been a gentle, babbling companion, became a rushing torrent that required careful navigation around slippery rocks and treacherous drops. It was Rose who first noticed they were being watched. She stopped suddenly, her hand gripping Ruby's arm with surprising strength for such a small child. "Something's following us," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the dense underbrush that lined the creek. Ruby peered in the direction her sister indicated, her heart already beginning the race. At first, she saw nothing but shadows and branches swaying in the afternoon breeze. Then a movement caught her eye, something large and dark shifting between the trees, keeping pace with them but maintaining its distance. "A bear?" she whispered. Back, they had seen bears before, usually from the safety of their cabin porch. Their father had taught them that most bears would avoid humans if given the chance, but a hungry bear in late fall, preparing for winter hibernation, could be unpredictable and dangerous. The twins stood frozen for several long minutes, watching the shadows, before whatever had been following them melted back into the forest as silently as it had appeared. Shaken, but determined to continue, they pressed on, now constantly glancing over their shoulders and jumping at every sound the forest made around them. The carefree exploration of the morning had transformed into something altogether more sinister, a reminder that they were small and vulnerable in a world that cared nothing for their survival. As the afternoon wore on, their pace slowed considerably. The bread they had brought was already half gone, eaten more from nervousness than hunger, and the water in their father's canteen was running low. The terrain continued to climb, and the friendly creek of the morning had become a series of small waterfalls and rocky pools that were increasingly difficult to navigate. It was while they were resting beside one of these pools, trying to decide whether to risk drinking the clear mountain water, that Rose made the discovery that would change everything. While Ruby scouted ahead for the best route forward, Rose was absently examining their mother's few possessions when her fingers found something unusual in the lining of their mother's old dress, something that crinkled like paper but felt harder, more substantial. "Ruby," she called softly, her voice carrying a note of excitement that brought her sister running back immediately. "Look at this." With careful fingers, Rose had worked open a small section of the dress's lining to reveal a silver locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful in its intricate design. The locket was heart-shaped, with delicate engravings of flowers and vines that spoke of a craftsman's loving attention to detail. But it was what they found inside that took their breath away. The locket contained a small photograph, faded and slightly water-damaged, but still clear enough to recognize. It showed their mother as a young woman, but she was not alone. Beside her stood a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, his arm around her waist in a gesture of obvious affection. But this was not their father. The face in the photograph belonged to a stranger, someone the twins had never seen before. Ruby turned the locket over in her small hands, studying the photograph with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient text. "Who is he?" she wondered aloud, though in her heart she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. Rose leaned closer, her finger tracing the edge of the tiny photograph. "Maybe he's the mountain man," she said, voicing what they were both thinking. "Maybe that's why Mother knew about him. Maybe that's why she told us to find him." The discovery transformed their desperate flight into something else entirely, a quest with purpose, a journey toward answers as much as safety. Their mother's dying words took on new meaning, and the mysterious figure in the photograph became not just a potential savior, but a link to a past they had never known existed. As evening approached, the twins found themselves faced with a choice that would test their resolve. The creek had led them to a point where it split into 3 smaller streams, each disappearing into a different canyon. There was no obvious path to follow, no sign to indicate which direction might lead them to the man they sought. The temperature was dropping with the setting sun, and they could see their breath beginning to form small clouds in the cooling air. They spent the last hour of daylight searching for some indication of which path to take. It was Ruby who finally spotted it, a thin column of smoke rising from somewhere high up the middle canyon. barely visible against the darkening sky, but unmistakably the product of human habitation. Someone lived up there, someone with a fire and presumably a shelter to go with it. "That has to be him," Ruby said, pointing toward the distant smoke. "That has to be the mountain man." Rose nodded, clutching the silver locket against her chest like a talisman. "We'll reach him tomorrow," she said, with the confidence that only children can muster in the face of the impossible. They spent that night huddled together, in a shallow cave they found beside the creek, sharing what remained of their bread and water while the temperature dropped below freezing for the first time that season. Neither twin slept much, both because of the cold and because of the anticipation of what the next day might bring. They took turns keeping watch, listening to the sounds of the mountain night, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl, and always, somewhere in the darkness, the sense that they were being observed by unseen eyes. When dawn finally broke over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that their mother would have called a gift from heaven, the twins were already awake and preparing to resume their journey. The smoke they had seen the evening before was still visible, a thin gray line rising straight up in the still morning air, like a beacon calling them home. As they began the climb toward that distant chimney, neither twin could have imagined what awaited them at the end of their journey. They knew only that somewhere ahead lay either salvation or doom, and that they had no choice but to continue forward into whatever fate the mountains had prepared for them. The homestead appeared suddenly, as if the mountain itself had decided to reveal one of its carefully guarded secrets. After hours of climbing through increasingly difficult terrain, Ruby and Rose emerged from a stand of pine trees to find themselves looking down into a small hidden valley where smoke rose from the chimney of a log cabin that seemed to grow directly from the rocky soil. The cabin was larger than their own had been, built with the kind of precision that spoke of both skill and abundant time. Every log was carefully fitted, every joint sealed against the mountain weather. A covered porch ran along the front of the structure, and several outbuildings were scattered around the main house: a workshop, a storage shed, and what appeared to be a small stable. Split rails formed neat fences that enclosed a kitchen garden and a pen that currently held no animals, but showed signs of recent use. But it was the man himself who captured their attention and held it with a mixture of fascination and fear. He was chopping wood in the clearing behind his cabin, his movements efficient and rhythmic despite his obvious age. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with hair gone completely gray and a beard that reached nearly to his chest. His clothes were simple but well-made wool pants, a flannel shirt, and boots that had seen years of mountain use but were still solid and serviceable. Even from their distant vantage point, the twins could see the care with which he approached every task. Each swing of his axe was measured and precise, splitting the logs cleanly with an economy of motion that spoke of decades of practice. When he paused to stack the split wood, he arranged each piece with an attention to detail that suggested a man who took pride in doing things properly. Even when no one was watching, Ruby and Rose spent the better part of an hour observing him, hidden among the trees like small woodland creatures studying a potential predator. They watched him tend to his garden, checking plants that were clearly preparing for winter dormancy. They saw him disappear into his workshop and emerge with tools that needed sharpening, working the whetstone with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. What struck them most was his solitude. In all the time they watched, he never once looked toward the forest as if expecting company. He never paused his work to listen for approaching footsteps or voices. This was clearly a man who had grown accustomed to being completely alone, who had organized his life around the assumption that no other human beings would ever intrude upon his carefully ordered existence. Hidden among their mother's belongings, Rose discovered something that made her gasp softly. Wrapped in an old piece of cloth was a rusted tin star, a sheriff's badge that had seen better days, but still bore the word sheriff stamped into its surface. The metal was tarnished nearly black, and one of the points had been bent, but there was no mistaking what it was. He was a lawman, Rose whispered, showing the badge to her sister. That's why Mother thought he could protect us. Ruby studied the badge, turning it over in her small hands. The back bore an inscription so faded, it was barely readable, but she could just make out the words, Gunnison County, and what might have been a date from many years before. This man, this mountain hermit who chopped wood with such methodical precision, had once sworn an oath to protect and serve the people of these mountains. As the afternoon wore on, they began to notice details that spoke to the man's character in ways that simple observation couldn't convey. He spoke gently to a red squirrel that had grown bold enough to approach his woodpile, offering it a handful of nuts from his pocket. When a hawk circled overhead, he paused in his work to watch its flight with what appeared to be genuine appreciation for its grace and beauty. These were not the actions of a man who had grown hard and cruel in his isolation, but it was also clear that this was not a man who welcomed surprises or unexpected visitors. Everything about his homestead spoke of careful planning and controlled environment. Even his woodpile was arranged with military precision, and his tools were cleaned and stored with the kind of attention to detail that suggested a man who found comfort in order and routine. The twins were still debating how to approach him when fate made the decision for them. Rose, who had been fighting a fever since their cold night in the cave, suddenly swayed on her feet and would have fallen if Ruby hadn't caught her. The younger twin's face was flushed with illness, and her breathing had become labored in a way that reminded Ruby horribly of their mother's final days. I don't feel good, Rose whispered, her voice barely audible even to her sister. Ruby felt her sister's forehead and found it burning with fever. Whatever cold or illness Rose had picked up during their journey was rapidly getting worse, and Ruby knew with the clarity that comes only in moments of crisis that they had no choice but to reveal themselves and ask for help. The mountain man looked up from his work when he heard the sound of footsteps approaching his cabin. For a moment, he simply stood frozen, his axe still raised above his head, as if his mind couldn't quite process what his eyes were telling him. Two small children were emerging from the forest, one half carrying the other, both of them looking as lost and desperate as any creatures he had ever seen. His first instinct was to retreat, to disappear into his cabin and wait for them to go away. He had spent years perfecting his isolation, building a life that required nothing from other people and gave nothing in return. The last thing he wanted was complications, especially complications that came in the form of children, who would ask questions he wasn't prepared to answer. But as he watched them struggle across the clearing, he found himself remembering things he had spent years trying to forget. The older girl moved with a determination that reminded him of someone from long ago, and the younger one's obvious illness stirred feelings he had thought were dead forever. Despite every instinct that told him to turn away, he found himself walking toward them instead. "Please, sir," Ruby said when he was close enough to hear her voice clearly. "My sister is sick, and we don't have anywhere else to go. Our mother said to find the man in the mountains, and you're the only one we found." He looked down at them, too. Small girls with faces that spoke of hardship beyond their years, carrying themselves with a dignity that poverty couldn't touch. The sick one was clearly running a dangerous fever, and both of them showed signs of exposure and exhaustion that suggested they had been traveling for days. For a long moment, he said nothing, his internal battle playing out across features that had grown stern from years of solitude. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul, he made a decision that would change all of their lives forever. "Bring her inside," he said quietly, his voice rusty from disuse but still carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We'll see what we can do about that fever." The interior of the mountain man's cabin was unlike anything the twins had ever seen. Where their own home had been cramped and makeshift, This space spoke of careful planning and years of patient work. The main room was spacious and well lit, with windows that had actual glass rather than the oil paper that had served their family's needs. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth large, enough to heat the entire space and cook meals for a family. But it was the small details that told the real story of the man who lived here. In one corner sat a child's wooden toy horse, carefully carved and painted, but worn smooth by countless small hands. A woman's shawl hung on a peg by the door, faded with age but still beautiful in its intricate pattern. Children's books shared shelf space with volumes on agriculture and medicine, and a cradle sat in the corner, covered with a dustcloth but still waiting, as if its owner couldn't quite bring himself to put it away forever. The mountain man, who introduced himself simply as Jacob after several minutes of awkward silence, moved through his home with the efficiency of a man who had lived alone for years. But his actions betrayed a familiarity with caring for others that suggested this had not always been the case. He prepared a bed for Rose with practiced ease, mixing herbs for tea with the confidence of someone who had treated fevers before, and his hands were gentle when he checked her temperature. "She needs rest and fluids," he said, his voice still gruff but not unkind. "The fever should break in a day or two if we keep her warm and get some nourishment into her." Ruby watched him work with a mixture of gratitude and caution. This man was helping them, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes would dart toward the door, as if calculating how quickly he could retreat from this unexpected invasion of his solitude. Everything about his manner suggested someone who was profoundly uncomfortable with their presence, but couldn't bring himself to turn away from children in need. As evening fell, and Rose's fever began to respond to Jacob's treatment, the older twin found herself examining the possessions their mother had left them with new understanding. The wooden cross, the silver locket with its mysterious photograph, even their mother's Bible seemed to take on deeper significance in this place that clearly held memories of its own. It was while Jacob was outside checking his animals that Ruby discovered the most telling artifact of all. Hidden in a drawer that she had opened while looking for something to help make Rose more comfortable, she found a collection of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes was familiar. It was their mother's careful script, though these letters were dated years before the twins were born. The letters were addressed to "My dearest Jacob," and even without reading their contents, Ruby understood that she was looking at evidence of a love story that predated her parents' marriage. Her mother and this mountain man had shared something important, something that explained why Margaret had directed her daughters to seek him out in their hour of greatest need. When Jacob returned from his evening chores, he found Ruby sitting by Rose's bedside, the letters in her lap and tears streaming down her face. He stopped in the doorway, his expression cycling rapidly through surprise, pain, and something that might have been relief. "She wrote to you," Ruby said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before she married Papa, she wrote to you." Jacob stood frozen for a long moment, then slowly crossed the room to sit in the chair across from her. His movements had the careful deliberation of a man approaching something that might explode if handled roughly. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the letters. Ruby handed them over and watched as Jacob's weathered hands trembled slightly while untying the ribbon. He didn't read the letters. Instead, he simply held them, staring at his own name written in Margaret's careful hand, as if seeing a ghost made flesh. "Your mother and I grew up together," he said finally, his voice so quiet that Ruby had to lean forward to hear him. "We were going to be married, had all the plans made. The life we were going to build together mapped out like a surveyor's plot. But then, he stopped, the words catching in his throat like stones. "What happened?" Ruby asked, though she wasn't sure she really wanted to know the answer. Jacob was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, His voice carried the weight of years of regret and self-recrimination. I was sheriff in Gunnison County back then, young and full of righteous anger about cleaning up the territory. There was a gang causing trouble, and I went after them alone when I should have waited for help. They killed my wife and children while I was off playing hero. Ruby felt her breath catch in her throat. The toy horse, the woman's shawl, the cradle in the corner, suddenly it all made terrible sense. Margaret tried to help me through it, Jacob continued. She was patient and kind, everything a grieving man could want in a friend. But I was drowning in guilt and anger, and I couldn't see past my own pain. I told her I couldn't marry her, couldn't give her the life she deserved. I thought I was being noble, setting her free to find happiness with someone who wasn't broken. But she loved you, Ruby said, the words coming out more as a statement than a question. Jacob nodded, his eyes focused on something far beyond the walls of his cabin. And I loved her more than my own life. But love isn't always enough, child. Sometimes the things that break us stay broken, no matter how much love tries to fix them. The revelation hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, heavy with implications that neither of them was quite ready to examine. Ruby understood. Now why her mother had sent them here, why she had trusted this broken man to care for her daughters when she no longer could. Margaret had loved Jacob Montrose once, and despite everything that had happened between them, she still believed in the goodness that lived beneath his pain. Over the next few days, as Rose's fever gradually broke and the younger twin began to regain her strength, an unspoken agreement developed between Jacob and the girls. They would stay until Rose was fully recovered, and then, well, none of them wanted to think too carefully about what would happen then. But as the days passed, something began to shift in the careful balance Jacob had maintained in his isolated world. The sound of children's voices in his cabin, the sight of small faces around his table, the simple act of caring for someone other than himself, it all awakened feelings he had spent years trying to bury. "We can't stay here forever," Ruby said, one evening as they sat by the fire after Rose had fallen asleep. Jacob nodded, though something in his expression suggested the words caused him physical pain. "No," he agreed quietly. "You can't." But even as he said it, both of them knew that sending the twins away would be like tearing open wounds that had only just begun to heal. October faded into November, and with it came the first serious snows of the season. What had begun as a temporary arrangement while Rose recovered gradually transformed into something that none of them had quite planned, but all of them had begun to need. The twins settled into the rhythms of Jacob's carefully ordered life, while he found himself adapting his solitary existence to accommodate two small but determined presences. The days developed a pattern that felt both foreign and familiar to all of them. Jacob would rise before dawn, as had been his habit for years, but now he found himself building up the fire not just for his own comfort, but to ensure the cabin would be warm when the girls awakened. Ruby proved to be an eager student of mountain survival, following Jacob around his property with the focused attention of someone who understood that her life might depend on what she learned. Rose, still recovering but growing stronger each day, showed a natural talent for the domestic arts, helping with cooking and mending with skills that impressed even Jacob's exacting standards. It was during one of these quiet domestic mornings that Rose made the discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about their situation. She had been helping Jacob clean and organize his storage areas when she found a collection of letters hidden behind some preserved food stores. Unlike the letters Ruby had discovered earlier, these were not from their mother to Jacob, but rather letters that had never been sent, correspondence that Jacob had written, but never mailed. The letters were addressed to Margaret, written in Jacob's careful hand over the course of many years. They chronicled his life in the mountains, his struggles with grief and isolation, his gradual acceptance of his self-imposed exile. But more than that, they revealed a man who had never stopped loving the woman he had let go, who had continued to pour his heart on the paper, even knowing that she would never read his words. "You wrote to her," Rose said, her voice soft with wonder as she brought the letters to Jacob, where he sat repairing a harness by the fire. Jacob looked up from his work, and Rose could see the moment he realized what she had found. His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, embarrassment, and finally a kind of resignation that suggested he was tired of keeping secrets. "I wrote to her," he confirmed, setting aside his work to take the letters from Rose's small hands. "Every week for the first year after I came up here. Then every month. Then just on her birthday and at Christmas. I never sent them. What would have been the point? She had married your father and built a life without me." Ruby joined them by the fire, drawn by the quiet intensity of the conversation. "What did you write about?" she asked. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if they might hold answers to questions he had never dared ask aloud. "I wrote about the mountains," he said finally. "About the way the sunrise looks when it hits the peaks just right. About the animals I saw. About the seasons changing. I wrote about missing her, about wondering if she was happy, about hoping her children would grow up strong and kind like their mother." Rose climbed into the chair beside him, her small presence somehow making it easier for Jacob to continue. "I wrote about regret," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About all the things I should have said and done differently. About the life we could have had together if I hadn't been such a fool." The twins exchanged glances, both of them, beginning to understand the full weight of the tragedy that had shaped not only Jacob's life, but their mother's as well. Margaret had carried this lost love with her through her marriage to Samuel, through the birth of her daughters, through all the struggles and joys of her mountain life. And Jacob had carried it too, writing letters to a ghost while the real woman lived and loved and eventually died just a few valleys away. "She kept your picture?" Ruby said quietly, pulling out the silver locket that had started their understanding of this complicated history. "Even after she married Papa, she kept your picture." Jacob took the locket with hands that trembled slightly, opening it to stare at the faded photograph of two young people who had once believed their love could conquer anything. "We were going to have a summer wedding," he said, his voice thick with memory. "She had already started making her dress, and I was building furniture for the house we planned to share. We had names picked out for the children we wanted to have. Though irony was not lost on any of them, that the children Margaret had dreamed of having with Jacob were now sitting in his cabin, orphaned and in need of exactly the kind of protection and love he had once promised to provide for a family of his own. Over the following days, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted subtly but significantly. Jacob began to share more stories about his past, about the man he had been before grief changed him, about the dreams he had abandoned when he retreated to the mountains. The twins, in turn, shared memories of their parents, painting a picture of Margaret's life that helped Jacob understand how the woman he had loved had grown and changed. In their years apart, it was during one of these conversations that they heard the first sounds that would shatter their newfound peace. Ruby was outside gathering kindling when she heard voices carried on the wind-rough men's voices that spoke of tracking and hunting and the satisfaction that comes from closing in on quarry. She dropped her armload of wood and ran back to the cabin, her heart racing with a fear she couldn't quite name. "There are men coming," she said breathlessly as she burst through the cabin door. "I heard them talking down in the valley." Jacob was on his feet immediately, his body language transforming from relaxed domesticity to alert wariness in the space of a heartbeat. Years of isolation hadn't dulled his instincts. If anything, they had sharpened them. "How many voices?" he asked, moving toward the window that offered the best view of the approaches to his homestead. "At least 3, Ruby replied, joining him at the window while Rose instinctively moved closer to both of them. They were talking about tracking. Something about not giving up until they found what they were looking for. Jacob's jaw tightened as he processed this information. In all his years in the mountains, he had rarely been troubled by visitors, and never by groups of men who spoke of tracking and hunting. The isolation that had been his refuge might suddenly become a trap if these strangers had hostile intentions. Did they sound like they were hunting animals? He asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Ruby shook her head. They were talking about people, she said quietly. About children who needed to be found. The words hit Jacob like a physical blow, and suddenly all the pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed began falling into place. 2 orphan children, alone in the wilderness, carrying possessions that might be more valuable than anyone had realized. The timing of their arrival, the desperation that had driven them to seek him out, the possibility that their parents' deaths had not been the natural tragedies they had seemed. For the first time since the twins had stumbled into his carefully ordered world, Jacob began to understand that their presence might bring more than just emotional complications. They might bring danger as well, the kind of danger that a retired lawman knew how to recognize even when he couldn't yet see its full-shaped dot. As he watched the tree line for signs of approaching strangers, Jacob made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of calculating how quickly he could convince the twins to move on and restore his peaceful isolation, he found himself planning how best to protect them from whatever threat was approaching his mountain sanctuary. The man who had once worn a sheriff's badge, who had sworn an oath to protect and serve, was awakening from a long sleep. And for the first time in years, Jacob Montrose had something worth fighting for. The men made camp in the valley below just as the sun was setting, their fire visible through the trees like a malevolent eye watching Jacob's homestead. Through his field glasses, a relic from his law enforcement days, Jacob could make out 3 figures moving around the flames, but the distance and gathering darkness made it impossible to identify them or assess their intentions with certainty. What he could see was enough to concern him. These were not casual travelers or lost hunters. Their camp was organized with military precision, their gear expensive and well-maintained, and their positioning suggested men who understood tactics and surveillance. They had chosen a spot that offered clear sight lines toward Jacob's cabin, while providing multiple escape routes if needed. "Are they looking for us?" Rose asked, her voice small and frightened as she pressed close to Jacob's side. Jacob lowered the field glasses and considered how much truth a child her age could handle. "I don't know yet," he said finally, "but we're going to assume they might be until we know otherwise." The next several hours were spent in careful preparation. Jacob moved through his cabin with the efficiency of a man reverting to long dormant training, checking weapons that hadn't been touched in years, reviewing escape routes that he had planned but never expected to use, and making mental inventories of supplies that might be needed for either siege or flight. The twins watched his transformation with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The gentle mountain hermit who had nursed Rose back to health and shared his meals with them was revealing another aspect of his nature. The lawman who had once tracked dangerous men through these same mountains, who had faced violence and survived it through skill and preparation. "Your father," Jacob said to Ruby as he cleaned and loaded an old Winchester rifle. "Tell me about how he died. Everything you remember, everything your mother told you." Ruby recounted the story she had heard so many times, Samuel leaving to investigate reports of a new gold strike, his promise to return before winter, the search parties that found his abandoned camp, but no trace of the man himself. As she spoke, Jacob's expression grew increasingly grim. "Your mother never told you about any trouble he might have been having?" Jacob asked. "Men who might have owed him money, or who he might have owed money to?" The twins shook their heads, but something in Jacob's manner suggested he was beginning to form theories they might not want to hear. It was Rose, who made the next discovery that would reshape their understanding of their situation entirely. While helping Jacob secure the cabin for what might be a difficult night, she found something sewn into the lining of their mother's old dress, something that crinkled when she pressed against it but felt too substantial to be paper. "There's something else hidden in here," she told Jacob, showing him the place where careful stitching had created a secret pocket. Jacob examined the dress with the methodical attention of a man who had once searched crime scenes for evidence. His fingers found the hidden seam and carefully opened it, to reveal a piece of oiled cloth wrapped around something flat and rectangular. Inside the cloth was a hand-drawn map, crude but detailed, showing landmarks that Jacob recognized from the surrounding territory. The map showed the location of their family's cabin, marked with a small cross, and a trail leading from there to a spot marked with an X and the words S. Muncash, written in Samuel's careful hand. Distance markers along the trail suggested a half-day's journey from their home to whatever Samuel had hidden at the marked location. "Your father hid something," Jacob said, studying the map by lamplight. "Something valuable enough that he drew a map to find it again." Ruby leaned over his shoulder to examine the drawing. "What kind of cash?" Jacob's expression was grave as he considered the implications. "If I had to guess, I'd say gold. Your father found his strike after all, but instead of coming home with it, he hid it somewhere safe and made a map so he could find it again later." The revelation transformed everything they thought they knew about Samuel's disappearance and their current predicament. If their father had indeed found gold and hidden it, and if word of that discovery had somehow reached the wrong people, it would explain why dangerous men might be tracking his family years after his death. "They think we know where it is," Rose said, with the clarity that children sometimes bring to complex situations. Jacob nodded grimly. "And they're probably right. You do know where it is. You're carrying the map." The weight of this knowledge settled over them like a suffocating blanket. The twins had fled their home thinking they were orphans seeking shelter, but they were actually treasure bearers being hunted by men who would kill for what they carried. Their mother's dying wish to seek out Jacob wasn't just about finding care for her children. It was about putting them under the protection of the one man in these mountains who might be able to keep them alive. As the night deepened, Jacob made his plans with the calculating precision of a chess master, thinking several moves ahead. The men below would likely wait until dawn to make their approach, giving him a few hours to prepare his response. He could try to slip away with the twins. Under cover of darkness, the three people moving through unfamiliar terrain in the dark would be vulnerable and easy to track. Better to use the advantages his position offered: high ground, prepared defenses, and intimate knowledge of the local terrain. "We're going to stay and fight," he told the twins, his voice calm despite the magnitude of what he was proposing. Ruby looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her 8 years. "Will you be able to protect us?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, honestly considering the question. 3 armed men against 1 aging former lawman and 2 small children. The odds were not good by any conventional measure. But conventional wisdom didn't account for preparation, knowledge of terrain, or the fierce protectiveness that had awakened in him since the twins' arrival. "I'm going to try," he said finally. "But I need you both to understand that tomorrow might be very dangerous. You'll need to be brave and do exactly what I tell you when I tell you to do it." Both twins nodded with a solemnity that broke Jacob's heart, even as it filled him with pride. These children had already survived more hardship than most adults ever faced, and they were preparing to face even greater challenges with courage that humbled him. As they settled in for what might be their last peaceful night together, Jacob found himself thinking about the irony of his situation. He had retreated to these mountains to escape the violence and responsibility that had defined his younger years, only to find himself preparing for battle once again. But this time, The stakes were not abstract concepts of law and order. They were two small lives that had become more precious to him than his own. Outside, the campfire in the valley below burned on through the night, a constant reminder that morning would bring a reckoning that none of them could avoid. Dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains, with a bitter wind that carried the promise of the first serious snowfall of the season. Jacob had been awake since well before sunrise, moving quietly through his cabin and making final preparations. While the twins slept fitfully in the bed he had given them, every sound from outside sent his hand instinctively toward the rifle that leaned against the wall within easy reach dot. It was Rose who spotted them first, her sharp eyes catching movement among the trees that lined the approach to Jacob's homestead. "They're coming," she whispered. Pressing her face against the window glass, Jacob joined her at the window, his field glasses confirming what her young eyes had detected. 3 men were making their way up the mountain trail, moving with the careful precision of hunters who knew their quarry was aware of their approach. They were still too distant to make out individual features, but their body language spoke of professional competence and dangerous intent. "Ruby," Jacob called softly to the older twin, who was checking the barricades they had erected during the night. "Come here and tell me if you recognize any of these men." Ruby peered through the field glasses, studying each figure with the intensity of someone whose life might depend on accurate identification. "I've never seen them before," she said finally. "But," she paused, something in one man's movements triggering a half-formed memory. "But what?" Jacob prompted. "The way the tall one walks," Ruby said slowly. "It reminds me of someone who came to our cabin once, maybe a year ago. Mama said he was asking about Papa, about where Papa had gone when he disappeared." Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. If these men had been tracking Samuel's family for over a year, it suggested a level of patience and determination that made them far more dangerous than casual opportunists. The approaching men had stopped their advance about a quarter-mile from the cabin, taking position behind a rocky outcropping that offered both cover and a clear view of Jacob's defenses. Through his field glasses, Jacob could see them conferring, obviously planning their next move with the kind of tactical discussion that confirmed his worst fears about their capabilities. It was while he was observing their planning session that Rose made the discovery that would change everything they thought they understood about their situation. She had been absently examining their mother's few remaining possessions when her fingers found yet another hidden compartment, this one sewn so skillfully into the hem of Margaret's burial dress that it escaped notice until now. "There's something else," Rose said, her voice carrying a note of excitement despite their desperate circumstances. Jacob reluctantly turned away from his surveillance to see what she had found. Rose had carefully opened the hidden seam to reveal not another letter or photograph, but a small roll of papers that had been wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture. The papers were official documents. Mining claim registered in Samuel's name, a receipt for assay services that showed an estimated value that made Jacob's breath catch in his throat, and most importantly, a detailed survey map that showed not just where Samuel had hidden his gold, but exactly how much gold he had found. "Dear God," Jacob breathed as he studied the assay report. "Your father didn't just find gold. He found one of the richest strikes in Colorado Territory. This says he pulled out nearly $1,000 worth in just 2 weeks of work." Ruby peered over his shoulder at the papers, trying to make sense of the official language and technical terms. "Is that a lot?" Jacob's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "That's enough to kill for Ruby. That's enough to hunt a family for years. Your father didn't just disappear. He was murdered for this claim, and these men have been looking for his family ever since." The revelation recontextualized everything that had happened to them. Their mother's long illness took on new significance. When viewed as the slow death of a woman trying to protect her children from men who would kill for what she knew, Samuel's disappearance was not the tragedy of a failed prospector, but the murder of a man who had struck it rich at the worst possible time. "But there's more," Rose said, holding up one final document that Jacob had overlooked in his shock at the assay report. The last paper was a will, properly witnessed and notarized, in which Samuel left everything he owned to his wife and daughters. But more importantly, it contained detailed instructions for what Margaret should do if anything happened to him. Instructions that included seeking out Jacob Montrose, former sheriff of Gunnison County, and placing the family under his protection. He knew, Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel knew these men were tracking him, and he knew they would come after his family eventually. That's why he hid the gold instead of bringing it home. That's why he left instructions for Margaret to find me. The weight of responsibility that settled on Jacob's shoulders in that moment was heavier than anything he had carried, even during his days as a lawman. Samuel had trusted him to protect the family he couldn't protect himself, and Margaret had honored that trust by sending her daughters to his mountain refuge when she could no longer keep them safe. Outside, the three men had finished their planning and were beginning to advance toward the cabin in a coordinated pattern that spoke of military or law enforcement training. They moved with the confidence of professionals who had tracked many quarries to ground and never failed to claim their prize. But as Jacob watched them approach, he felt something awakening in himself that had been dormant for years. The badge might be tarnished and the oath long forgotten by everyone else, but the man who had once sworn to protect and serve was still there beneath the layers of grief and isolation. These children were under his protection now, not by law but by something far more binding, the sacred trust placed in him by two people who had loved them enough to plan for their safety even in death. "What are we going to do?" Ruby asked, her voice steady despite the fear that Jacob could see in her eyes. Jacob set down the field glasses and picked up his rifle, checking the action one final time. "We're going to remind these gentlemen that some treasures are too well protected to steal," he said. The transformation in his demeanor was remarkable to witness. The gentle mountain hermit who had nursed Rose back to health and shared his table with them was gone, replaced by a man who moved with the deadly precision of a predator defending his territory. Years of peaceful isolation had not dulled his instincts. If anything, they had refined them, stripping away everything that was not essential to survival. "I want you both to go to the root cellar," Jacob instructed, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed in dangerous situations. "There's a tunnel that leads from there to the stable. If things go badly, you take that tunnel and keep going until you reach the cache site your father marked on his map. The gold is yours by right, and you'll need it to build new lives somewhere far from here." Ruby shook her head stubbornly. "We're not leaving you to fight alone." Jacob looked down at her, this 8-year-old child who had already survived more hardship than most adults ever faced, and felt his heart swell with pride and love that surprised him with its intensity. "You're not leaving me alone," he said. "Gently, you're giving me something to fight for." As the sound of approaching footsteps grew closer, Jacob took his position at the window that offered the best field of fire toward the main approach to his cabin. The men who thought they were hunting helpless children were about to discover the bare quarry was protected by something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. A man who had finally found something worth dying for, and who intended to make sure that dying wouldn't be necessary. The last sheriff of Gunnison County was about to teach these treasure hunters that some badges never truly tarnish, and some oaths are never really forgotten. The first shot came without warning, shattering the morning silence and sending splinters flying from the cabin's front door. Jacob had been expecting it, but the twins jumped at the sudden violence, their faces going pale with terror at this first taste of real combat. "Stay down," Jacob commanded, his voice calm despite the adrenaline that was flooding his system. And remember what I told you about the root cellar? The shot had been a test. Jacob realized a way for the attackers to gauge his response and defensive capabilities. They would be watching to see how many defenders were in the cabin, what kind of weapons they had, and how professionally they handled themselves under fire. Jacob had no intention of giving them easy answers. He waited, counting slowly to 30 before firing a single, carefully aimed shot at the rock outcropping where he had last seen movement. The bullet struck stone and ricocheted with a sharp whine. But Jacob's real purpose was not to hit anything. It was to demonstrate that he was armed, accurate, and not easily intimidated. The response came quickly in the form of 2 more shots. These aimed at different windows and clearly intended to drive him away from his observation post. Jacob smiled grimly as he moved to a new position. These men were competent, but they were also predictable, following patterns he had learned to recognize during his years as a lawman. "They're trying to make us use up our ammunition," he explained to the twins as another volley of shots peppered the cabin's exterior. "They want us to panic and start shooting wildly. Instead, we're going to wait for our opportunities and make every shot count." Ruby crawled across the floor to join him at his new firing position, her young face set with determination that reminded Jacob painfully of her mother. "What can we do to help?" Jacob considered the question seriously. In any other circumstances, he would have insisted that children stay as far from combat as possible. But these were not ordinary circumstances, and these children had already proven themselves capable of extraordinary courage. "I need you to watch the back of the cabin," he said finally. "These men are too smart to attack from just one direction. When they make their real move, they'll try to come at us from multiple angles. If you see any movement at all, you tell me immediately." The twins nodded and took up positions at the rear windows, their small faces pressed against the glass as they scanned the forest for signs of approaching danger. Jacob was struck by how naturally they adapted to the situation, how quickly they understood what was needed without lengthy explanations. Outside, the shooting had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that Jacob found far more unsettling than the gunfire had been. Silence meant the attackers were moving, repositioning themselves for whatever came next. It meant the real battle was about to begin. He used the quiet moments to examine more carefully the artifacts that had revealed so much about their situation. The cavalry saber that hung above his fireplace was more than just a decoration. It was a weapon he had carried through the Indian Wars before taking up the sheriff's badge, a tool he had hoped never to need again, but which might prove essential before this day was over. Taking down the saber, Jacob felt the familiar weight of the weapon in his hands. The blade was still sharp, the balance perfect, the leather-wrapped grip molded to his hand by years of use. He had been a different man when he last drew this weapon in anger, younger and more certain about the rightness of violence in service of justice. Now he was older, more aware of the cost of such certainty, but also more desperate in his need to protect what mattered most. "Tell me about your father's cache," he said to Ruby as he cleaned and checked the saber's edge. "Everything you remember. About the map, about the route he marked out." Ruby closed her eyes, concentrating on the details she had memorized from the hand-drawn map. "It's about 4 hours' walk from our old cabin, following the creek upstream until it splits, then taking the left fork to a meadow marked with 3 large boulders. The cache is buried at the base of the middle boulder." Jacob nodded, filing away the information for future use. If the worst happened, if he fell in the coming fight, the twins would need to know how to find their inheritance and use it to build new lives somewhere, far from these mountains and the men who hunted them. "And if I don't survive this," he continued, his voice matter-of-fact despite the weight of what he was saying, "you take that gold and you go to Denver. You find a lawyer, a real lawyer, not some frontier charlatan, and you have him help you establish your legal claim to your father's strike. With proper documentation and enough money to back your claim, you can live well and safely. Rose looked up from her watch at the rear window, tears streaming down her face. "You're not going to die," she said fiercely. "You can't die. We just found you." Jacob's heart clenched at the raw emotion in her voice. These children had lost so much already. Their father to violence, their mother to illness, their home to circumstance. The thought of adding his death to their list of losses was almost unbearable, but he had learned long ago that good intentions were no guarantee against bad outcomes. "I'm planning to survive this," he told her gently. "But plans don't always work out the way we hope. If something happens to me, I need to know you'll be able to take care of each other." The conversation was interrupted by a new sound from outside, the distinctive crack of breaking branches that suggested someone moving through the forest with less than perfect stealth. Jacob moved quickly to the window that offered the best view of the sound source, his rifle already in position as he searched for targets. What he saw made his blood run cold. The three men had split up, just as he had expected, but their positioning was even more sophisticated than he had anticipated. One man was approaching from the front, using the cover of scattered boulders and fallen trees to work his way closer to the cabin. Another was circling around toward the stable and outbuildings, clearly intending to attack from that direction. But it was the third man who worried Jacob most. He had climbed high up the mountainside and was now positioned to fire down into the cabin from an elevated angle that made most of Jacob's defensive preparations useless. "They're very good," Jacob murmured, more to himself than to the twins. "Better than I expected." The realization forced him to reevaluate his entire strategy. He had been thinking like a sheriff defending a jail, holding a static position against assault. But these men were clearly experienced in this kind of hunting, and they had positioned themselves to make such a defense untenable. If he was going to protect the twins, he would need to think less like a lawman and more like a soldier. "Change of plans," he announced, already moving toward the weapons cabinet where he stored additional firearms and ammunition. "We're not going to wait for them to come to us. We're going to take the fight to them." Ruby looked up at him with surprise. "All of us?" Jacob shook his head. "You two will go into the root cellar, just like we planned. But instead of waiting there for the outcome, you're going to use the tunnel to get to the stable. From there, you can make your way to the cache site if things go badly." "And what are you going to do?" Rose asked, though her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. Jacob checked the loads in 2 pistols, tucking one into his belt and keeping the other in his hand along with the rifle. "I'm going to remind these gentlemen that hunting children is a dangerous profession." The transformation that came over him as he prepared for battle was remarkable to witness. The gentle mountain hermit disappeared entirely, replaced by a man who moved with the deadly efficiency of a predator preparing to hunt. Years of peaceful isolation had not dimmed his instincts. If anything, they had refined them, stripping away everything that was not essential to survival and victory. "When I give the signal," Jacob instructed, "you go to the cellar and you don't come out until you hear me call your names 3 times. If you don't hear that signal within an hour, you use the tunnel and you don't look back." The twins nodded, their faces solemn with understanding of what he was asking them to do. They were being forced to choose between staying to help him fight and following his instructions to save themselves. It was an impossible choice for children who had already lost so much, but Jacob could see in their eyes that they understood the necessity of it. Outside, the men were getting into position for their final assault. Jacob could see the one in front making his last dash from cover to cover, closing the distance to the cabin with professional skill. The man circling toward the stable was almost in position as well, and the sniper on the mountainside had settled into a firing position that would give him clear shots at anyone moving around the cabin. Jacob kissed each twin on the forehead, a gesture that felt both like a blessing and a farewell. "Whatever happens," he told them, "remember that you are loved. Your parents loved you, and I love you. That love will keep you safe, even when I can't." As the twins made their way toward the root cellar, Jacob took one last look around the cabin. That had been his refuge for so many years. Then he drew his saber, checked his firearms one final time, and prepared to step outside to face whatever fate the mountains had prepared for all of them. Jacob stepped out of his cabin into the crisp mountain air with the measured calm of a man who had made peace with whatever fate awaited him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the clearing, and somewhere in those shadows, 3 armed men were positioning themselves for what they believed would be an easy kill. They were about to learn otherwise. The first shot came from the sniper on the mountainside, the bullet splitting the air where Jacob's head had been a fraction of a second before. But Jacob was no longer there. Years of combat experience had taught him to never move in straight lines when death was hunting. He rolled behind the woodpile he had so carefully stacked, using the split logs as cover while he assessed the positions of his attackers. A signal mirror flashed from the trees behind the stable rows, following his instructions to provide intelligence from her position in the root cellar. 2 quick flashes meant the man circling toward the rear was almost in position. Jacob smiled grimly and prepared to upset their carefully laid plans. Instead of waiting for the coordinated assault they were planning, Jacob went on the offensive. He burst from behind the woodpile at a dead run, not toward cover, but directly toward the man advancing from the front. The unexpected movement caught his attacker off guard, forcing him to take a hurried shot that went wide as Jacob closed the distance between them. Jacob's rifle barked once, the shot carefully aimed and deadly accurate. The first attacker dropped without a sound, his weapon falling uselessly beside him. Jacob didn't pause to confirm the kill in combat. Hesitation was death, and he had 2 more threats to neutralize. The sniper on the mountainside adjusted his aim, trying to track Jacob's erratic movement pattern, but the former sheriff was already diving for new cover behind a boulder that would block the elevated angle of attack. The bullet struck stone inches from his head, sending fragments flying but doing no real damage. From his new position, Jacob could see the 3rd man making his approach toward the stable, obviously intending to flank the cabin and attack from an unexpected direction. What he didn't know was that Jacob had prepared for exactly this possibility, and the stable held more than just horses and hay. Jacob triggered the first of several carefully placed charges he had rigged during the long night of preparation. The explosion was not large, just enough black powder to collapse part of the stable's roof and create a shower of debris that would discourage any immediate assault from that direction. The blast echoed off the surrounding peaks like thunder, and Jacob could hear the 3rd attacker cursing as his approach route suddenly became impassable. The sniper, perhaps rattled by the unexpected explosion, made the mistake of revealing his position as he shifted to get a better angle on Jacob's current cover. Jacob spotted the movement immediately and responded with a shot that came close enough to convince the hidden marksman that staying in one place was unhealthy. 2 down, 1 to go, Jacob muttered to himself, though he knew the remaining attacker was probably the most dangerous of the 3. Anyone skilled enough to position himself for a sniper shot from the mountainside was not going to be easy to outmaneuver or outfight. Jacob's assessment proved accurate. When the next shot came not from the mountainside, but from a completely different angle, the sniper had abandoned his elevated position and was now moving through the forest, using the terrain and vegetation to mask his approach. This was no amateur treasure hunter, but a professional killer who understood advanced tactics. The twins, watching from their concealed position, saw something Jacob could not. The sniper was working his way around to a position that would give him a clear shot at Jacob's current cover. Rose flashed the signal mirror frantically, trying to warn him of the approaching danger. Jacob caught the warning signal and immediately understood its meaning. Instead of waiting for the attack, he began moving again, using the same unpredictable pattern that had served him in the first engagement. But this time, his opponent was ready for such tactics. The shot came from less than 50 yards away, close enough that Jacob could hear the distinctive crack of the rifle, even as he felt the bullet pass close enough to tug at his shirt. His return shot was instinctive, fired even as he dove for new cover, but it found its mark with the deadly accuracy that had made him legendary among his fellow lawmen. The forest fell silent except for the sound of Jacob's own breathing and the distant whisper of wind through the pine trees. 3 men had come hunting what they thought were helpless children, and now 3 men lay dead in the mountain clearing, testament to the protective fury of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. But even as Jacob began to relax, thinking the immediate danger was over, a new sound reached his ears, the distant rumble of more horses approaching up the mountain trail. The 3 dead men had not been working alone, and their failure to report back had apparently triggered the arrival of reinforcements. The real battle was just beginning. The sound of approaching horses grew steadily louder, and Jacob's heart sank as he realized the full scope of what they were facing. Through his field glasses, he could count at least 6 riders making their way up the mountain trail, all of them armed and moving with the purposeful advance of men who had come to finish what their advance scouts had started. Jacob had just proven he could handle 3 attackers, but 6 men with horses and superior numbers presented an entirely different challenge. Worse, his ammunition was running low after the first engagement, and he had no way to resupply without returning to the cabin, a move that would expose him to sniper fire from the approaching force. It was then that he heard something that filled him with both pride and terror, the sound of small footsteps moving through the forest behind him. Ruby and Rose had disobeyed his direct orders and were making their way toward the battle instead of fleeing to safety. "Get back to the cellar," he hissed as they reached his position behind the boulder. "I told you to stay hidden until this was over." Ruby's face was set with the same stubborn determination he had seen in her mother's features years before. "We're not leaving you to fight them alone," she said firmly. "Besides, we brought you something you need." She held up their mother's wedding ring, the simple gold band that Margaret had worn throughout her marriage to Samuel. But it was Rose who explained its significance as she pressed it into Jacob's palm. "Mama told us to give this to you when you needed to remember who you were fighting for," Rose said, her young voice carrying wisdom far beyond her years. "She said it would remind you that families protect each other, no matter what." Jacob stared down at the ring, his vision blurring as he remembered the day Margaret had shown it to him before her wedding to Samuel. He had been bitter then, consumed with jealousy and self-pity that had blinded him to the deeper meaning of her gesture. She had been trying to tell him that love takes many forms, and that the love they had shared would always be part of who she was, even as she moved forward with her life. Now, holding that same ring while preparing to defend her children with his life, Jacob finally understood what Margaret had been trying to tell him all those years ago. Family was not just about blood or marriage. It was about the choice to protect and care for those who needed protection and care. "Thank you," he said simply, slipping the ring onto his finger, where it settled as if it had always belonged there. The approaching riders had reached the base of the final slope that led to Jacob's homestead, close enough now that he could make out individual faces and assess their weapons and capabilities. These were not the rough frontier types he had expected, but professional gunmen with expensive equipment and military bearing. Someone with serious money had hired them, which meant the stakes of this confrontation went far beyond a simple treasure hunt. "Listen to me carefully," Jacob said to the twins as he checked his remaining ammunition and prepared for what might be his final stand. "I need you to get to that signal mirror and use it to flash a message toward the valley." Ruby looked confused. What message? 3 long flashes, then 3 short, then 3 long again, Jacob instructed. Keep repeating that pattern until someone responds. Rose's eyes widened with understanding. That's a distress signal. But who would see it? Jacob's smile was grim but determined. Your father wasn't the only one who knew about the gold strike in these mountains. There are other prospectors in the area, and some of them are men I worked with during my law enforcement days. If they see that signal, they'll know someone needs help. It was a desperate gamble, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Jacob positioned himself for the coming assault while the twins made their way to the signal mirror, their small forms moving with the stealth and determination of seasoned scouts. The lead rider was close enough now for Jacob to see his face. Clearly, a hard man with cold eyes and the bearing of someone who had killed many times before. This was the leader of the group, the man who had organized this elaborate hunt for 2 orphan children and their hidden treasure. Jacob Montrose, the man called out, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. We know you're up there, and we know you've got the girls with you. Send them down, and we'll let you live. This doesn't have to be your fight. Jacob's response was a single, carefully aimed shot that knocked the man's hat clean off his head. The hell it doesn't, he called back. The battle was joined immediately, with all 6 riders spurring their horses toward Jacob's position while firing from horseback. But as the first volley of bullets began to fly, something remarkable happened. Answering, rifle fire began erupting from the forest on 3 sides of the clearing. The signal mirror had done its work. Help had arrived in the form of men who remembered their debts to a sheriff who had once protected these mountains, and who were not about to let harm come to the children under his protection. The real Jacob Montrose had returned, and he was not fighting alone. The gunfight ended as suddenly as it had begun, with the surviving members of the hunting party either dead or fleeing back down the mountain trail under a withering crossfire from men who knew these mountains better than any outsider ever could. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of approaching footsteps as Jacob's unexpected allies emerged from the forest. To survey the aftermath of the battle. Old Tom Henderson was the first to reach Jacob's position, his grizzled face breaking into a grin as he saw his former sheriff alive and relatively unharmed. Behind him came 3 other prospectors and former deputies, men who had answered the distress signal without question because they remembered what it meant to serve under Jacob Montrose. Figured you might need some help, Tom said with the understated humor that mountain men used to mask deeper emotions. Word's been going around that some professional killers were asking questions about the area. Seemed like the kind of problem that might require multiple solutions. Jacob clasped his old friend's hand, overwhelmed by gratitude and the sudden realization that his years of isolation had not erased the bonds he had forged during his law enforcement career. These men had dropped everything to ride to his aid, risking their own lives for children they had never met simply because Jacob had called for help. Ruby and Rose emerged from their hiding place, their faces pale but determined as they surveyed the clearing where so much violence had taken place. In their defense, they had witnessed more bloodshed in a single morning than most people saw in a lifetime, but they carried themselves with the dignity of those who understood that sometimes violence was the price of protection. Are we safe now? Rose asked, her small hand finding Jacob's as she looked around at the men who had come to their rescue. Jacob considered the question carefully before answering. The immediate threat was over, but the men who had hired these killers were still out there, and they would likely send more hunters once word of this failure reached them. True safety would require more than just winning a single battle. We're safe for now, he said finally, but we need to make sure you stay safe for the future. The solution came from an unexpected source. Tom Henderson had been examining the documents that Ruby and Rose had discovered among their mother's possessions. and his weathered face showed the kind of recognition that comes only from long experience with frontier law and territorial politics. "I know who's behind this," Tom announced, holding up the mining claim that had started the entire deadly chain of events. This claim was filed properly, but it overlaps with a much larger claim filed by the Consolidated Mining Syndicate about 6 months later. They've been trying to void the original claims through legal challenges, but if there are living heirs with proper documentation, then the original claim takes precedence. Jacob finished, beginning to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. They weren't just after the gold Samuel had already found. They wanted to eliminate his heirs so they could claim the entire strike for themselves. The revelation transformed their situation from a simple treasure hunt to something much more significant. Samuel had not just found gold, he had filed a legal claim to one of the richest strikes in Colorado territory, a claim that his daughters now inherited by right of law. With proper legal representation and the backing of honest men, Ruby and Rose could not only claim their father's treasure, but also establish themselves as legitimate mining heirs with resources that would last them for life. Over the following days, as word of the failed attack spread through the mountain communities, a remarkable thing happened. Men and women who had known Samuel and Margaret began arriving at Jacob's homestead, bringing with them stories, memories, and offers of help that painted a picture of parents who had been far more beloved in the community than their daughters had ever realized. Sarah Williams, who had taught school with Margaret in Denver, arrived with a wagon full of supplies and an offer to help the twins continue their education. Former mining partners of Samuel's brought documentation that supported his claim and testified to his character and honesty. Even the territorial judge made the journey to Jacob's mountain refuge, bringing with him the legal expertise needed to ensure that Samuel's claim would be properly protected and his daughters' inheritance secured. It was during one of these visits that Rose made her final artistic contribution to their story. Working with charcoal and paper that Sarah Williams had brought, she created a portrait of their new family herself, Ruby and Jacob, standing together in front of the cabin that had become their home. The drawing was simple but profound, showing 3 people who had found each other across the vast loneliness of loss and discovered that love could create family bonds stronger than blood. "This is who we are now," Rose said as she showed the portrait to Jacob, her young voice carrying absolute certainty about their future together. Jacob studied the drawing, seeing reflected in its simple lines a truth that had taken him years to understand. Family was not something you were born into. It was something you chose to create through love, sacrifice, and the daily decision to care for those who needed caring. Margaret had known this when she sent her daughters to find him. Samuel had known it when he trusted Jacob to protect what mattered most to him. And now Jacob knew it too, as he looked at 2 small girls who had transformed his house into a home and his existence into a life worth living. "Yes," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion that he no longer tried to hide. "This is who we are." As winter settled over the mountains and the first heavy snows began to fall, the 3 of them worked together to prepare for the season ahead. They were no longer a reclusive hermit and 2 orphan children. They were a family, bound together by choice and circumstance and the kind of love that grows stronger under pressure. The mountain man had found his purpose, and 2 small girls had found their home. In the end, that was treasure enough for any of them.